Psalms chapter 143. Psalms 143. I like these little short chapters in Psalms. Psalms is a great book. It's a very practical book. And if you live very long on this earth, you need the book of Psalms. It's a comfort in times that you would get it nowhere else. Today we'll look at the subject matter of David's deliverance from despair. You find this in the chapter. We know David. David is a man, he stands out in the Bible as just a stalwart soldier for Christ. Well, Jehovah, back then. We would think of it as Christ. But as just a picture of what Christianity ought to be. Here we find David, the anointed of God, the champion of the valley of Elah, the mighty man of war, the sweet psalmist of Israel, but he's outgunned and outmanned and out of human ability and resources. And here's what he says. Verse 1. A psalm of David. Hear my prayer, O Lord. Give ear to my supplication. In thy faithfulness answer me, and in thy righteousness. And enter not into judgment with thy servant, for in thy sight shall no man living be justified. For the enemy hath persecuted my soul, he hath smitten my life down to the ground. He hath made me to dwell in darkness, as those that have been long dead. Therefore is my spirit overwhelmed within me. My heart within me is desolate. I remember the days of old. I meditate on all thy works. I muse on the work of thy hands. I stretch forth my hands unto thee. My soul thirsteth after thee, as a thirsty land, Selah. Hear me speedily, O Lord. My spirit faileth. Hide not thy face from me, lest I be like unto them that go down into the pit. Cause me to hear thy loving kindness in the morning. For in thee do I trust. Cause me to know the way wherein I should walk, for I lift up my soul unto thee. Deliver me, O Lord, from mine enemies. I flee unto thee to hide me. Teach me to do thy will, for thou art my God. My spirit, thy spirit is good. Lead me into the land of uprightness. Quicken me, O Lord, for thy name's sake, for thy righteousness' sake. Bring my soul out of trouble. And of thy mercy cut off mine enemies, and destroy all them that afflict my soul, for I am thy servant. This is a good thing for us to remember. Here he is. He's been through life, and life has beat him up. If you've not been there before, hang on, it's coming. You'll be there many times in life. You feel like you've hit a dead end. You're at the edge of a precipice, and nothing can save you. Here's what he says. He says, deliver me from mine enemy. Lead me into the land of uprightness. Bring my soul out of trouble. He's facing some unconquerable situations here, in his mind anyway. So he's got to have some help. He's looking for God to answer him. He says, hear my prayer. Now, I like the way the Psalms are laid out. You can take the first word or the first phrase of a chapter and compare it. I don't know you can do this with all of them, but I've done it with many, many of them. And it sums up the whole thing to take the first and last phrase of a chapter, and you get the summary of the whole chapter. Here it is. Look at it. In verse 1, he says, hear my prayer. Last phrase in 12, for I am thy servant. That's who God listens to. And he does something for him. Let's find out. David's in despair. He needs to come out of it. Let's first of all notice his complaint. Verse 3. For the enemy hath persecuted. So, what does he need? He needs a liberator. He's talking to the right one. He says, they've smitten down my life to the ground. What's he need now? He needs a life giver. Good thing he went to God. Nobody else can do that for him. Nobody. He says he's in darkness, so he needs perfect light. Well, he's gone right to the source of light. Those are all things no man can do for you, and you can't invent on your own. As great a man as David was, these were all beyond his means, and they will be beyond ours too. He says in Psalms 4, verse 6, there be many that say, who will show us any good? Lord, lift thou up the light of thy countenance upon us. Now that's where we get light. It's from God's countenance. That's the source of light. The source of light is not the sun. That's something God threw out in the sky up there. But that sun could quit shining and there would still be light if his countenance shone on you. That's where real light comes from. He says in Numbers 6, verse 25, this is the benediction that's being given to the nation of Israel. Numbers 6, verse 25. This is a great passage. This is one of those, when you're going through trouble, you need to read this one. He says, the Lord make his face shine upon thee, and be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee, and give thee peace. You know what the light from God gives you is peace. You need that light. I need that light. We all do. Now, he says, lift up his countenance. Not everyone's countenance is lifted up. If you scowl at somebody, that's not a lifted countenance. That's a downcast countenance. That's a scowl. That's looking down on somebody. A lifted up countenance means you're happy. When you're happy, when you smile, your face lifts up. I don't know, because I never do it. No. In Psalms chapter 44, he says this. Psalms 44, verse 3. Talking about the nation of Israel. He says, for they got not the land in possession by their own sword, even though it seems like they did. Neither did their own arm save them, but thy right hand and thine arm, and the light of thy countenance, because thou hadst a favor unto them. When God's happy with you, he mows down the enemy for you. We need that. David sure did. He needed some light. He said, it feels like I'm in darkness. What I need is your countenance. Do something that makes God happy. Now, our reason behind it shouldn't be, we're doing it so God will do this for me. Okay, you don't wheel and deal with God. But as a Christian, you should want to make him happy. Find out something that makes him happy. And I can't tell you what that is. You get in the Bible and find it. And just your relationship with God tells you what that is. Make his countenance settle on you. And that gives peace. In Psalms 89, verse 15, he says this, blessed is the people that know the joyful sound. They shall walk, O Lord, in the light of thy countenance. That's where joy is found. Now, that's just the opposite of the position that we found David in. He said, I'm in trouble, I'm in darkness, everything's going around me, everybody's trying to kill me, and, it feels like I'm in despair here. Well, he says right there, in the light of his countenance is joy. So, you need some more joy in your day? We all do. There it is right there, it's in his countenance. In John chapter 8, verse 12, Jesus talks to the people and clearly says, you've been reading that Old Testament, let me explain it to you in vivid color. I am the Old Testament. John 8, verse 12. Then spake Jesus again unto them, saying, I am the light of the world. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. A lot of people that are breathing are not living. They might think they're alive, but until you have Jesus Christ, you don't even have life. And the light of this new life is Jesus Christ. A lot of Christians still are not walking in the light of their new life. It's Jesus Christ. In 2 Corinthians 4, verse 4, he says it this way, in whom the God of this world hath blinded the minds of them which believe not, lest the light of the glorious gospel of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine unto them. So the gospel, good news of Jesus Christ, that light is so powerful, the devil can't stand anybody seeing it. So he tries to blind their mind, put their mind in darkness. Even a Christian at times will find himself in what he feels like is darkness. The mind get clouded. The devil's at work on him. Okay, open up the Word of God. Get God's countenance to shine on you. It's right there, the glorious gospel. Gospel's good news. Christians shouldn't be walking around moaning and complaining and, oh, everything's so bad and horrible. Not for us. We're supposed to be walking in the light of life, where joy is. He says in our passage in Psalms chapter 143, Look at verse 4. He says, therefore is my spirit overwhelmed within me. Oh, he's got some complaints here. And they're legitimate. I mean, really, they are. He did feel overwhelmed. Now, God was going to take care of business. God always had taken care of business for him. And God was in the future and still is going to do more for him in the future. However, in the nasty now and now, overwhelm was reality. So let's see what God says about it. Psalms 55, verse 5. Psalms 55, verse 5. Here's David again. He doesn't have to think back very far to find being overwhelmed. It's happened throughout his lifetime. Guess what? You're going to have bad things that repeat throughout your whole lifetime. Now, I know that wasn't a great encouragement, but that's just a fact. And the devil wants you to focus on those. And you can. You can ruin the rest of your life because of the three things that keep repeating. Or you can look at the deliverer who got you out of those things every time they happened. Here he says in Psalms 55, verse 5, fearfulness and trembling are come upon me, and horror hath overwhelmed me. Overwhelmed him. That's like drowning. The wave just takes you. He says sometimes horror and fear just overwhelms you. Like a wave, it just crashes right over the top of you. And you'll find in life sometimes it happens out of nowhere. It's almost like we are actually in the sea. And you'll have times of peace, and then you'll have times of just nothing but fear and tragedy. Here's how to get over it. Psalm 61, verse 2. Psalm 61, verse 2. He says, from the end of the earth will I cry unto thee. That's exactly what our whole psalm in 143 is about. Psalm 61, 2, he says, from the end of the earth will I cry unto thee. When my heart is overwhelmed, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. Now that's a good prayer right there. When you're overwhelmed, there's no magic formula that means you'll never be overwhelmed again. There's not one. Because God likes hearing us. He likes us talking to him. And he says, when that happens, you can talk to me. That's when you see my power. If you don't get in trouble, he never gets an opportunity to exhibit his power. Psalms 142, verse 3. Psalms 142, verse 3. Now here's where it really gets pointed. Here's where the mirror of life reflects who you are. Psalms 142, verse 3. When my spirit was overwhelmed within me, then thou knewest my path. When you get overwhelmed in life, who you really are shines through. We reveal ourselves in trouble. When everything's going hunky-dory and we've got plenty of everything, you can play the super spiritual and how great I am and all those things because you've got no problems. But when problems strike, you tell everybody who you really trust. He says, in the way wherein I walked, have they privately laid a snare for me. When you're being trapped at every turn, your path becomes revealed to everybody who watches. He said in our passage there back in Psalms 143, in verse 4, the last phrase of it, he says, my heart within me is desolate. Desolate. What does desolate mean? Any ideas? Desolate.
No hope at all.
No hope? Okay. Empty. Okay. I think of desolate as being, you think of a desolate desert or wilderness or something, as being void, empty. I'll show you. The Bible uses it a little different. The Bible's definition of desolate is to be conformed to nature, to revert back to what nature does. Rather than you building or cultivating something, If you leave your hands off it, it becomes desolate. Nature takes over and does its thing. Let's look at just a few of them in the Bible. Genesis 47, verse 19. He says, "Wherefore shall we die before thine eyes, both we and our land?" Okay, here's the Egyptians. They've come to Joseph and they said, "Look, we're dying out here. We've been paying you. We need some grain. This is the 7 bad years." He says, the Egyptians tell him this, "Buy us and our land for bread, and we and our land will be servants unto Pharaoh. And give us seed that we may live and not die, that the land be not desolate." So if you don't plant on the ground becomes desolate. It doesn't suddenly become a desert. It may overgrow with weeds. Down here, Johnson grass will consume it. That's being desolate. It's doing something on its own. You didn't direct it. In Exodus 23:29, God's talking to the children of Israel about conquering Canaan. He says, "I will not drive them out from before thee in 1 year." Oh, that's what we all want, don't we? Hey, God, I've got all these problems. Get rid of them. And here's his answer to us. I'm not going to get rid of them all at once. I'm going to do it a little bit at a time. But here's what he says. "Lest the land become desolate, and the beasts of the field multiply against thee." He said, those enemies out there are doing some good. You couldn't occupy all of the land right now. Therefore, I've got them out there controlling the wild animals, keeping the beast at bay. They're doing a job for you. They're working for you, even though you're going to have to drive them out eventually. In Leviticus 26:22, he says this, "I will also send wild beasts among you, which shall rob you of your children, and destroy your cattle, and make you few in number, and your highways shall be desolate." Okay, as a highway is obviously a man-made thing. You go out there and you clear the path and you pave it and put stones down or whatever they do to make a highway. He says it's going to be desolate. That is, nobody's going to be going up and down it. What happens when you find what do they call those things? The pavers that they put in the roads. Pavers, but there's a fancy name for it. Anyway, yeah, those things. Cobblestone. There we go. Cobblestone. You ever seen a cobblestone road that was not maintained?
Oh, yeah.
It becomes a grass field. Yeah, that's desolate. Desolate. If you don't run up and down that highway, there's no traffic on it, nature takes over. That's desolation. In Psalms 25, verse 16, he says this, "Turn thee unto me, and have mercy upon me, for I am desolate and afflicted." You know what that means? God's not doing any work on him. Therefore, nature has taken over. Man can easily become desolate. Unless God is cultivating you, you're desolate. The course of nature has taken over. In Romans 12, the verse everybody knows or should know, Romans 12, verse 2, he says this, "And be not conformed to this world." That's desolation. "But be ye transformed." That's cultivation. "By the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." Now we've seen one thing. We've seen David's complaint. Look at Psalms 143 again, and we'll see his constraint. The great thing about David, and we find this all through the life of David, you almost become good friends of David by reading the Bible. You feel like you really know him. You can see his personality come out. You find here his attitude is right. That's one thing about David. He may have messed up several places, but his attitude was right. Boy, that's a tough thing to do. If you can get your attitude right, God can steer you in the right direction easily. But when that attitude gets wrong, it takes you changing before God can move you. Righteousness, I say this, righteousness is not driven by activity. I wish the whole world would get this. Righteousness is not doing righteous acts. That's not how you achieve righteousness. It's not by the things you do. That's not the end result. Now, that may result in righteousness. But righteousness is not driven by activity. It's driven by attitude. If you can get your attitude right, then a right action will follow the right attitude. But if your attitude is not right, you can count on it. The action ain't going to be right. Now, we might fake an action. We might, put on a suit and, look all super spiritual. Well, that's just a fake action that God sees right through. It ain't righteousness. A right attitude is a mandate for right action. Here, David is going to do something very interesting. Look at verse 1. Psalms 143, verse 1. He's crying out. He's in despair. He says, hear my prayer. You ever done that? Sure. If you're more than just an American Christian, you've been in problems before and you cry to God. You say, hear me. I got this problem. Look at verse 7. Hear me speedily. Pick up the speed dial. Now that's a good thing. 2 times he cried out and said, listen up, I need you. But he doesn't stop there. Anybody can do that. Anybody can say, Genie in the bottle, come out and do what I want. That's not what he says. His constraint is he's controlling himself. It's not my way or the highway. Let's have some communication. Verse 8. Cause me to hear thy loving kindness. Okay, God, I need the answer from you. I'm not going to tell you what the answer is. I'm telling you what the problems are. You tell me what the answer is. Verse 10. Teach me. That's the right attitude right there. I've got problems. Here's the situation. You tell me the answer. How many times do we go to God and say, here's the problem, do this? Maybe that's not what he's going to do. And maybe he knows something way better to do than that thing you just said. David's got the right attitude right here. And he says, I've got these problems. I don't know the answer. You cause me to hear. You teach me. That's good communication. Life's about communication. And if we don't have it, it can't be one way. Don't you hate getting in a conversation with somebody and they only are the ones who do the talking? You don't get to say anything? That just wears you out. I'm sure God feels that way many times. All we want to do, there's not a big move for this, but there is a bigger than you would think. A lot of people wanting to pray. We were just talking to somebody the other day about that. They like prayer, but they don't read their Bible. Okay, well, that's you doing all the talking. Don't you think the creator of this universe, the God who's in control of everything, has something to say? Sometimes prayer is good. You need that. But sometimes you need to shut up and let him start talking. There's where your answer comes from. In verse 5, Psalms 143, verse 5, he says, I remember the days of old. I meditate on all thy works. I muse on the work of thy hands. Now that's where it gets good. We've got to reflect. When you're in despair, when life has overwhelmed you, this is important to do. Remember the days of old. Hadn't God done some things for you in the past? Sure he has. That was not some magic formula or an accident that happened in the past. That's who God is. Remember that, because he's still the same God. So he starts reflecting. I remember the days of old. Then he does something else. I meditate on all thy works. Meditate. What's meditate? That's to think deeply. That is, you're determined to really put yourself in that spot mentally. You're meditating on it. Next phrase. I muse on the work of thy hands. What is to muse? This is the only time it's used in the Bible. I muse. Correct. It's to prepare speech based on a well thought out subject. Now, how in the world did I come up with that definition? I'm going to give you 3 definitions. You pick any of them that God says go for, or throw them all out and find your own. But this was my research on the matter. In Psalm 77, verse 12. Psalm 77, verse 12. Now hold your finger in Psalms 143, but go to Psalms 77:12. Notice how these verses are almost the same. This is one way I choose to learn what words mean, is find a verse that's similar when there's a word that's different and see if one word is explaining the other. So he says in Psalm 77:12, I will meditate also of all thy work. Really similar to what we saw in Psalms 143:5. He said there, I'll meditate on all thy works. Then the next part of the phrase in Psalm 77:12, and talk of thy doings. In Psalms 143:5, he says, and muse on the work of thy hands. So there, maybe it's meditating first, thinking through the thing very thoughtfully and on purpose, and now he knows what to say. Psalms 145, verse 5. Psalms 145, verse 5. I will speak of the glorious honor of thy majesty and of thy wondrous works. Okay, so he's going to talk about the things God has done. Okay, you don't just start spewing at the mouth, vain repetition and just, coming up with anything you feel like. No, he's thought this thing through. He's meditated on it. He's been reading God's word. He has that law hid in his heart. And now he's been thinking on it. And now he's ready to do what we know him as, write a poetry on it. Poet. He was a poet, the sweet psalmist of Israel. So a poem, I don't know how to conjugate that. A poem is a well thought out subject. Okay, you thought of the subject. Now you want to put words to it so people can remember, but it should provoke a moral, or it should provoke something that you're moving the person to do or to think. Webster's dictionary says this. Webster's 1828 dictionary. Muse. Verb intransitive from the Latin muso and musito. To mutter, to murmur, to demur, to be silent. The Greek signifies to press or to utter sound with the lips compressed. The latter verb belonging to the sound utter through the nose or with closed lips, or the same family of Latin musato. The word then primarily denotes what we call humming, or to hum, as a person when idle or alone, steadily occupied. Okay, so there Webster of 1828 or whatever, 1828, says the word muse just means to be sitting around thinking about something, and before you know it, sound starts being produced. Now, I've been there before, and you will too. When you're praying about something or you're thinking about something, and you're not audibly saying anything, you're thinking about it, but before you know it, some sound comes out. The emotion manifests itself in a noise. You've heard that. You've probably been praying before about something silently, and it's moved you so much that you just gave that grunt. That's a muse. That's a thought that's so heavy it forces its way out, and it's not necessarily in words. Now, our muse in our passage, I believe, is intended to be words. But also a muse is just an utterance here as a result of deep thinking. He says in the Webster's Dictionary, it means to ponder, to think closely, to study in silence. And then he gives our verse as the description of it. Psalms 143, verse 5. I muse on the work of thy hands. He says it means to be absent-minded and to be so occupied in study or contemplation as to not observe the passing scene or the things present. So there he says that muse means you're so engrossed in the works of God's hands that you're not even concerned about what's going on around you. When you're in despair, that's a good thing to do. Get so engrossed in something about God that you lose track of the thing you thought was so scary. That's a good thing to do. I'll give you one more definition. Muse from vocabulary.com. Now that's got to be current. It's probably worth nothing. But here's what they say. As a verb, to muse is to consider something thoughtfully. As a noun, it means a person who is the source of an artist's inspiration. Now, I like that. The work of God's hands, that is our inspiration. And if you can focus on that, that becomes the inspiration for anything you could say. And it should be. He says in our passage there, that's all my great study on the word muse. You do anything with it or nothing, I don't care. Back to our passage. Let's get to something that really matters. Psalms 143, verse 6. He says, I stretch forth my hands unto thee. My soul thirsteth after thee, as a thirsty land, Selah. Now that's Jesus. That's our man here. He's found himself in distress, and he says, look, what's really important, he started out with save me from trouble and enemies and problems and all, and now he's saying, what I'm really thirsty for is you. That's our answer. If you'll thirst for God, that answers all the problems. Because there is no problem bigger than God. If he's in the mix, he's bigger than the problem. He said, I stretch forth my hands unto thee. Now that's something. You find that people do this, not thinking, but when they praise or prayer type things, they lift their hands up. Now that meant something in the Old Testament, and it still means something. The old song says this, nothing in my hand I bring, simply to thy cross I cling. That means there's nothing here. It's all you. Nothing. I'm not holding anything back. In Psalm 66:18, he says this, if I regard iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear me. So he's saying, there's no iniquity I'm holding back. Clean hands. Nothing's here. Now that's the time to pray. Don't be praying with your hand behind your back holding on to wickedness and expect God to come down and save you out of trouble while you're hanging on to the world's devices, trying to hide it from him. Open those hands up, spread it out. There's nothing here. It's all yours. Look at it in Proverbs 15, verse 8. He says, the sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination to the Lord, but the prayer of the upright is his delight. God loves to hear a man come to him and say, all the cards are face up on the table. I'm holding nothing back. If they're saying here, let's get rid of it, and let me get you. Get rid of it. Don't hold anything back. 100% committed. In Isaiah chapter 1, verse 15, he says this, and when you spread forth your hands, he's been listening to what we're saying. I will hide mine eyes from you. Yea, when you make many prayers, I will not hear. Your hands are full of blood. Ouch. Don't be spreading your hands out when you got wickedness hidden away in the closet of your heart. God knows it. No fakers are allowed. David, in our passage, obviously has done some business with God because now he says, my hands are spread toward you. I'm not holding anything back. We've already dealt with iniquity and sin. We probably should be doing this every time we go to prayer. God, whatever sin's there, let's cleanse it. And then he'll start telling you what sins are there. He doesn't stay ambiguous. He identifies them. Get rid of them. You don't have to do it audibly so anybody else knows. It's none of their business. Usually. But get rid of it so you can get those clean hands out there and get a hold of him. In Job chapter 11 verse 13 he says this: if thou prepare thine heart and stretch out thine hands toward him, if iniquity be in thine hand, put it far away, and let not wickedness dwell in thy tabernacles. For then shalt thou lift up thy face without spot, yea, thou shalt be steadfast, and shall not fear. Now, some of our problems couch themselves in fear. Sometimes it's not so much the situation that is so bad, it's the fear that comes along with it, that emotion that attacks us. That emotion can be put away by having a clean heart and clean hands. He says right here, stretch your hands out there toward him. But verse 14, the warning, don't have no iniquity. Get rid of that first. And the blessings, verse 15, you're not going to fear. Get rid of the fear. So David's finding his answers here. Despair doesn't have to stay there. John chapter 7, verse 37. John 7, verse 37. Jesus says in the last days of the great feast of the tabernacle, Jesus stood and cried, saying, here's what Jesus has to say: if any man thirst, let him come unto me and drink. Sometimes God lets us get thirsty and be in the darkness so we crave him. He's the opposite of that. You know, there's nothing as good as a nice, cool, refreshing drink of water when you've been working hard, but you don't appreciate it if you're staying indoors in the AC all the time and you forget to drink water. You know, you got to force yourself to do it. You get out there and start sweating up a storm, buddy, you'll remember it real quickly. I need some water. And it's refreshing. Sometimes God lets us go through life's hard circumstances so we remember how refreshing he is. Okay, his conquest, last thing, and then we'll finish this message another time. His conquest. He finally gets over this situation. How does it happen? Psalms 143, verse 9. Psalms 143, verse 9. He says, I flee unto thee to hide me. There's the answer. It's not the mighty warrior David or his mighty men. You know, he talks about these mighty men and how great they were and all the battles they did and the great superhuman powers they had that God gave them. But here, that's not what's going to help David. He says, I flee unto thee to hide me. Sometimes you need God to hide you. I've been there. You will be there at some point. There's no covering for the trouble that's coming. There's no way out. 2 + 2 = 4. There's no way you can bend that math. But you can sure hide from it. He wants God to hide him. I've had God hide me when life should have added up to disaster, and it didn't, because God was hiding me. That's what David found. Look in verse 10. Verse 10, he says, teach me to do thy will, for thou art my God. Now, he's willing to do something here. He's willing to learn. It amazes me. Nobody has ever achieved the level where they're no longer a student. We're all still learning. Should be. If you're not still learning, you're a loser. I mean, really. He says David, I think David would be way head and shoulders above me. But here David himself is saying, teach me to do thy will. Now that's not just a nobody saying that. Look at Acts 13. Acts 13 verse 22. Acts 13:22. There's a prophecy on David. And when he had removed him, talking about Saul, he raised up unto them David to be their king, to whom also he gave testimony and said, I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after mine own heart, which shall fulfill all my will. God didn't force him to fulfill it. But he said, I know his attitude and his actions will follow. He will. Here's David exhibiting it. He's proving it. He says, God, teach me to do your will. It's not natural. It goes against the flesh. We've got to be like David, even in the middle of despair. When troubles and bombs are going off all around us, we need to say, okay, even here, I need to know and do your will. And that's something natural man doesn't get on his own. God, you've got to teach that to me. He said in our verse 10, Psalms 143, verse 10, Thy spirit is good. Lead me into the land of uprightness. Now that doesn't mean much to us. But this guy's a king. Anything he wants, he can have created. He didn't say, I'll build a land of uprightness. He didn't say, I'll outlaw this and that and we'll produce a utopia here that will make the world jealous of us. No, he didn't. He said, you lead me to that land. Now, that's the fact. We can't produce it on our own. God's got to take us by the hand and carry us where we need to go. In Psalms 143, verse 12, he says this, And of thy mercy cut off mine enemies, and destroy all them that afflict my soul. Now, this is an important phrase. I don't have time to get into it now. We'll probably cover it tonight. For I am thy servant. There's the key right there. Now, I'll just tell you what the conclusion is, and we'll do a conclusion another time. The conclusion is this. He's a servant, not a slave. A servant. You're either a servant or you're a slave. And as we'll find maybe tonight, a slave is run by the devil. God has servants. You have to volunteer for that position. That's what David's just done, and it's brought him out of despair. You're either a slave. If you choose not to be a servant, you will be a slave. But you can volunteer to be a servant.